I think I didn't do anything wrong, just teased about staying in a hotel with my ex. But my husband took it as betrayal, refused to laugh, and within weeks, I was staring at legal documents that stripped me of the control I thought I had. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. I've always believed that people who can't take a joke are the real problem, not the ones who make them. That's why, when I teased Deacon about how much cheaper it would be if I just shared a hotel room with Damien, my old boyfriend from years ago, I didn't think it was such a big deal. We were sitting at the dinner table after I'd come back from a work reunion, and I tossed the comment out casually, laughing as if it were the most harmless thing in the world. Deacon froze, his fork halfway to his mouth, and asked me if I was serious. I laughed again, louder this time, telling him he needed to loosen up, that he was too rigid and boring. I said he acted like a god instead of a husband. His jaw tightened, and I could see the fire in his eyes, but he didn't explode. Instead, he asked me why I thought saying things like that was funny. I shrugged, saying it was just a joke, nothing more. I added that the real issue wasn't my words, but his inability to trust me, and that made him controlling. In my head, I knew exactly what I was doing. Deacon had always been steady, serious, someone who wanted rules and boundaries, while I craved moments of freedom, reminders that I was more than just a wife and mother. Damien showing up at the reunion had been unexpected, and when people teased me about us once being inseparable, I played along. The drinks helped, loosening my tongue, making me bold. When I mentioned the hotel room joke at home, I thought Deacon would roll his eyes, maybe grumble, and then move on. Instead, he sat there silent, and that silence gnawed at me. I hated the way he could make me feel small without raising his voice. So I attacked first. I told him he was paranoid, that he always saw shadows where there were none, and that I was tired of walking on eggshells because he couldn't handle a joke. Later that night, I called my sister Eleanor and told her Deacon had overreacted to something silly. I described how he had sat there glowering like I'd confessed to an affair, when all I'd done was laugh about a hotel room. Eleanor laughed on the other end of the line, telling me Deacon had always been uptight, that men like him couldn't handle confident women. Her words soothed me. I repeated them to myself, convincing myself the problem wasn't my comment but his insecurity. Still, when I saw the way Clara, our 9-year-old daughter, hovered near the doorway that night, her eyes wide as she asked if Daddy was mad at me, I felt something tighten in my chest. I told her Daddy just didn't know how to laugh sometimes, that everything was fine, but she didn't look convinced. She slipped away quietly, hugging her doll, and her silence stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit. The next day at the clinic where I worked, whispers began. One of my co-workers, Melissa, grinned knowingly and asked if it was true I had joked about sharing a hotel room with my ex. I froze, wondering how the story had spread so quickly, but I forced a laugh and said people were making mountains out of molehills. I told her Deacon was just being dramatic, that it was all harmless banter. But when I walked down the hallway, I heard 2 others whispering about how, once a woman starts joking like that, it means something more. Their words made my stomach twist, but I refused to show weakness. I smiled wider, pretending I didn't care, pretending their judgment didn't matter. That evening, Deacon showed me his phone. Someone from the reunion had sent him a message, quoting my joke word for word, saying they couldn't believe I'd said it in front of everyone. Deacon didn't raise his voice. He simply asked me if I realized how it made him look, how it humiliated him, not just as a husband but as a man. I rolled my eyes, telling him he was obsessed with appearances, that he cared more about what others thought than about me. I said he was trying to control my personality, to cage me in like a prisoner. I accused him of being jealous, insecure, and suffocating. He didn't fight back. He just set the phone down, rubbed his temple, and left the room without another word. His silence felt like abandonment, and I hated him for it. That night, when I tried to talk to Clara again, she didn't want to sit beside me on the couch. She curled up at the far end, watching me with wary eyes. I told her Daddy was just being silly, that Mommy hadn't done anything wrong, but she stayed quiet, and that quietness spoke louder than words. For the first time, I felt a flicker of unease, but I buried it quickly under anger. Deacon was making me the villain in my daughter's eyes, I told myself, and I refused to let him win. I called Eleanor again, ranting about how Deacon was treating me, and she told me to stand my ground. She said if I let him control me now, he would never stop. I clung to her words, using them as justification. I told myself I was right, that Deacon was wrong, that the joke was harmless, and he was just insecure. But when I lay in bed that night, Deacon sleeping in the guest room, I stared at the ceiling, whispering over and over that I hadn't done anything wrong. Still, the words rang hollow in the silence. For the first time, I wondered if maybe the joke hadn't been as harmless as I had wanted it to be. Sunday dinners had always been noisy and warm at my parents' house, but this one felt like everyone was waiting for something to snap. I arrived with Deacon and Clara, carrying a casserole dish I barely cared about, forcing a bright smile onto my face. Deacon walked in behind me, quiet, shoulders tense, his silence drawing eyes before he even sat down. My mother greeted us politely, my father muttered about the weather, and Eleanor rushed over to hug me, her laugh a little too loud as she said she'd already heard about my hotel joke. I grinned, brushing it off, telling her Deacon had made it a bigger deal than it was. She giggled, nudging me playfully, while Deacon shot her a look that made her fall silent. Clara clung to his side, unusually withdrawn, refusing to meet my gaze. As we all sat down to eat, conversation moved awkwardly from work to neighbors, but the tension hovered like a storm cloud. Deacon ate slowly, his eyes fixed on his plate, while I made exaggerated attempts to liven the mood. I cracked small jokes, complimented the food too loudly, and tried to act as though nothing was wrong. But the silence around Deacon was contagious, spreading until finally he set his fork down and spoke. His voice was calm but heavy, the kind of tone that cut deeper than shouting. He said he felt humiliated, that my joke about sharing a hotel room with Damien had spread beyond the reunion and into whispers that followed him at work. He said people laughed at him now, that he couldn't stand being seen as the man whose wife joked about sleeping with her ex. I laughed immediately, shaking my head, insisting he was being absurd. I said it was just a joke, nothing more, and that only an insecure man would let words cut him so deeply. I accused him of ruining dinner with his paranoia, of dragging private matters into family time. Eleanor chimed in quickly, saying Deacon was too sensitive, that everyone knew jokes didn't mean anything. She said he needed to lighten up before he drove me crazy with his rules and suspicion. Her words bolstered me, and I smirked across the table, daring Deacon to challenge me further. But then Marjorie, his mother, slammed her fork onto the plate so hard the clatter silenced everyone. Her face was flushed, her eyes burning as she said no decent wife made jokes like that about her ex, not at a reunion, not in front of friends, and certainly not in front of her husband. She said I had shamed Deacon, mocked his dignity, and risked confusing Clara. I snapped back instantly, my voice rising, telling her she had hated me from the moment Deacon married me, that she had always looked for excuses to undermine me. I accused her of clinging to old-fashioned ideas, of trying to make me into someone I wasn't. She didn't flinch. She told me I had finally shown everyone the kind of woman I really was. The table fell into heavy silence. My mother whispered that maybe we should move on. That dinner wasn't the place for arguments, but her eyes avoided mine, her hands fidgeting with her napkin. My father shook his head, sighing, and said, children deserved better than this kind of tension. Clara sat frozen, her small hands pressed tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on her untouched plate. She didn't speak, but her silence was louder than Marjorie's scolding. Deacon didn't argue, didn't shout, didn't defend himself. He simply stood, slowly and deliberately, pushing his chair back from the table. Everyone watched him, expecting him to say something, but he didn't. He walked into the hallway, and when he returned, he carried Clara's small overnight bag and his own duffel. My stomach dropped as I realized he had come prepared. Clara looked up at him uncertainly, but when he extended his hand, she slid out of her chair without hesitation and took it. I asked where he thought he was going, my voice sharp, but he didn't answer. He didn't look at me, didn't explain himself to anyone. He simply told my parents in a quiet tone that they would be leaving early. Then he walked out the door, Clara trailing behind him, both of them disappearing into the night. The front door shut with a finality that left the entire table frozen. I laughed nervously, shaking my head, insisting he was just being dramatic, that he would be back once he cooled off. Eleanor chuckled weakly, saying he always acted like a martyr, that he liked to play the victim. I repeated her words, louder, telling everyone Deacon couldn't handle a confident woman. But Marjorie's eyes stayed fixed on me, her voice sharp as she said I had finally pushed her son too far. She said I had humiliated him in front of his family, in front of the community, and that he had finally grown tired of my games. My mother avoided my gaze, murmuring something about letting things rest for now, while my father excused himself from the table entirely. Eleanor tried to keep smiling, but even she looked uneasy. The silence stretched as the food grew cold, the laughter gone, the air thick with judgment. I forced myself to keep my chin high, pretending their looks didn't wound me, pretending I was still in control. But when I returned home later that night and saw the empty space where Deacon's shoes had been, the missing coat from the rack, and Clara's bed stripped of her favorite blanket, my chest tightened. I called Deacon, but he didn't answer. I left voicemails, first angry, then pleading, then threatening, but his silence was absolute. As I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark house, Eleanor's words replayed in my mind. Deacon was just being dramatic, he would come back. I clung to them like a rope, whispering aloud that I hadn't done anything wrong, that it had only been a joke. But in the hollow quiet of the house, even my own voice sounded unconvincing. His silence was not weakness. It was something else, something steadier, something I wasn't prepared for. 2 days later, I drove back to the house, convinced Deacon's little walkout had been nothing more than a stunt. I imagined he would be sitting at the kitchen table, waiting for me to apologize, ready to give in once I smoothed things over. But when I pulled into the driveway, the lights glowed from inside, as if everything was normal. Yet the moment I slipped my key into the lock, it didn't turn. I tried again, jiggling it harder, but the lock refused to budge. My breath caught as the realization sank in. He had changed the locks. Rage bubbled up, and I pounded on the door, calling his name, demanding he open up. After a long silence, I heard footsteps. The door cracked just enough for Deacon's hand to appear, sliding an envelope into mine. His face was calm, his tone steady as he told me I should stay somewhere else for now. I shouted that he had no right, that it was still my home, my marriage, my life. He didn't respond. The door clicked shut, the lock turned, and I stood frozen on the porch, neighbors' curtains twitching as they watched me unravel. I ripped open the envelope, my hands shaking, and inside were separation papers, formal, cold, stamped with the seal of his lawyer. My eyes blurred with fury as I scanned the words. He was making this real. My stomach turned, my pride burned, and humiliation weighed heavier than the papers themselves. I called Eleanor immediately, my voice trembling as I told her Deacon had locked me out. She laughed at first, saying he was bluffing, that he couldn't possibly mean it. She told me men loved to act tough, but they always caved once they realized they couldn't manage alone. Her words gave me a flicker of confidence, enough to keep standing on the porch with my head high, pretending I wasn't falling apart inside. The next afternoon I returned. I timed it so I knew Clara would be home from school. telling myself she would run to me, prove that Deacon couldn't keep her away. I knocked softly this time, rehearsing my lines, that I missed her, that everything would be fine, that Daddy was just confused. The door opened a crack, and Deacon appeared, his expression unreadable. He handed me another envelope. Inside was a visitation schedule, typed neatly, outlining when I could see Clara. My throat closed as I read, my hands trembling. I tried to push past him into the house, but he blocked me without raising his voice. He said everything I needed was in the papers. I accused him of cruelty, of brainwashing our daughter, of making me look like a stranger in my own family. Over his shoulder, I saw Clara at the end of the hall, peeking from the stairs, her small eyes wide and uncertain. I reached for her, calling her name, but Deacon shut the door firmly, leaving me pounding on it with my fists until my skin ached. That night, I drove to my parents' house, demanding they take my side. My mother looked uneasy, telling me Deacon seemed serious, that maybe I should speak to a lawyer. My father muttered that vows were meant to mean something, his disappointment sharp even in his quiet words. Their hesitation stung more than open condemnation. Only Eleanor seemed willing to defend me, telling me Deacon was being ridiculous, that he was acting like a dictator. She said I shouldn't let him intimidate me, and I clung to her words like they were lifelines, though even her voice lacked the certainty it once carried. By the end of the week, desperation pushed me to the schoolyard. When the bell rang, children poured out, and I spotted Clara immediately, her backpack bouncing as she walked. My heart leapt. I called her name, crouching low with a smile, but she froze. Deacon was right behind her, his hand steady on her shoulder. I told her I had missed her, that I wanted to take her for ice cream, but her eyes darted nervously between us. She whispered that she wanted to go home with Daddy. The words sliced through me, leaving me hollow. Other parents watched, their whispers pricking like needles. I tried to argue, telling Deacon he was cruel, that he was turning her against me, but Clara pressed closer to him. He didn't raise his voice. He simply guided her away, his silence heavier than all my shouting. That evening, I returned to my rented apartment, and another envelope was waiting in my mailbox. My chest tightened as I tore it open. Inside was a petition for temporary custody, stamped with the court seal. The language was cold, detached, and devastating. He had filed. He was no longer bluffing. My hands shook as I read, fear creeping into my anger. For the first time, I felt cornered. I poured myself a glass of wine, whispering over and over that it had just been a joke, just words, nothing real. But the mantra sounded brittle, hollow, like even I no longer believed it. At the clinic the next day, the whispers had grown louder. Melissa asked me if it was true Deacon had locked me out. I laughed stiffly, saying he was overreacting, but her eyes told me she already had her answer. Later, I overheard two nurses say that when a husband changes the locks, it means he has proof. My face burned, my pride twisted, but I kept walking, holding my head high, while their judgment followed behind me like a shadow. By Saturday, I returned to the house one more time, rage boiling in my chest. I shouted from the porch that he couldn't erase me, that he was tearing our family apart. The door opened, but this time Deacon wasn't alone. His lawyer stood beside him, folder in hand. Calmly, he explained I was not permitted inside until further rulings. He handed me another packet, thick with legal terms and deadlines. I screamed that they were conspiring, trying to destroy me. Deacon just stood, steady as stone, while Clara peeked again from the staircase, her small face pale. I reached out, but she turned quickly, running out of sight. The door shut with finality, leaving me alone with the folder clutched to my chest. Neighbors' blinds shifted, their silent eyes cutting into me. I whispered the same denial I had clung to from the start. I hadn't cheated. It was just a joke, nothing more. But standing there in the evening air, the papers pressing into my hands, I realized my words no longer carried weight. His silence was building something stronger than my excuses, something I couldn't stop. I thought if I could just control the story, I could still control the truth, so I threw myself into shaping how people saw me. At the clinic, I greeted everyone with exaggerated cheer, asking about their families, making jokes at the coffee machine, pretending nothing was wrong, but the whispers trailed behind me everywhere. I overheard 2 nurses muttering that a woman doesn't joke about sharing a hotel room with her ex unless she means it. Another co-worker smiled too sweetly as she asked if Deacon had really locked me out, as though she already knew the answer. I forced a laugh, brushing it off, insisting he was paranoid and trying to make me look bad, but their eyes told me they didn't believe me. I could feel their judgment hanging in the air long after I walked past. At the next family dinner, the atmosphere was suffocating. Deacon didn't come, which was somehow worse than if he had shown up and argued. His absence was a statement in itself. I walked in with Eleanor, who whispered that I should ignore everyone and hold my head high. I did exactly that, plastering a smile on my face and complimenting my mother's cooking, acting as though I wasn't unraveling. My father asked about work, my mother asked about Clara, but the questions were stiff, empty, the warmth gone. Before long, the conversation shifted. Marjorie, never one to keep quiet, demanded to know if I thought humiliating her son was funny. She said I had mocked him in public, made him the butt of jokes, and confused Clara in the process. I snapped back, saying she was biased, that she'd hated me since the day Deacon married me. I accused her of using any excuse to tear me down. Eleanor tried to defend me, laughing nervously, saying Deacon was too sensitive, that men always overreacted to things that didn't matter. Her words should have given me strength, but even she sounded unsure. My father shook his head, saying the whole situation was shameful, and my mother sighed, telling us to lower our voices for Clara's sake. My heart tightened when I looked at Clara. She sat silently at the table, moving food around her plate without eating, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth. I reached out to touch her hand, but she pulled back quickly, mumbling that she wasn't hungry. Her distance was like a blade twisting inside me. In the days that followed, I tried to build a new version of the story wherever I went. To neighbors, I said Deacon was controlling, punishing me over nothing. To co-workers, I painted myself as the victim of a jealous husband who couldn't handle a joke. Some nodded politely, but I saw the doubt on their faces. One friend finally asked me directly why I would even make such a joke in the first place. My throat went tight, and I snapped that she didn't understand, but even I knew how weak my answer sounded. The harder I tried to control the narrative, the more it slipped through my fingers. Determined to prove I still mattered, I showed up at Clara's school one afternoon. I told myself I'd surprise her, take her for ice cream, remind her that I was still her mother. I waited by the gate, heart pounding, rehearsing the smile I would give her. When the bell rang, she came out holding her backpack straps, her face weary for a child so young. I crouched down, calling her name brightly. She froze, her eyes darting nervously. Deacon appeared right behind her, his hand steady on her shoulder. I told Clara I had a treat planned, that I wanted to spend time with her, but Deacon said quietly that it wasn't my visitation day. I argued, accusing him of being cruel, of poisoning her against me, but Clara's eyes filled with tears. She pressed closer to him, whispering she wanted to go home. Other parents were watching, their whispers carrying across the parking lot, burning into me like fire. My cheeks flushed with humiliation. Deacon didn't argue. He simply walked away with her, his calm silence drowning out all of my rage. That night I called Eleanor, my voice sharp with panic. I told her Deacon was turning everyone against me, that he was trying to erase me. She told me not to worry, that the courts wouldn't side with him in the end, that I should hold firm. But her voice lacked conviction, and I caught the hesitation in her tone. For the first time, I realized she wasn't as certain as she used to be. Even my sister was starting to doubt me. A few days later, another envelope arrived in the mail, thick and heavy. When I tore it open, my hands shook. Inside was a petition for temporary custody, stamped with the court seal. The words blurred as I read them, but their meaning was undeniable. Deacon had already set the process in motion. He wasn't just punishing me. He was dismantling me piece by piece, using the law itself as his weapon. My chest tightened as fear clawed through me. I told myself it was still just a joke, that no court would take a child from her mother over words, but the seal on the paper told me otherwise. At the following family dinner, the cracks widened. Marjorie refused to look at me at all. My mother's face was weary. My father's disappointment was clear. Eleanor tried again to defend me, but her words were weak, her tone hesitant. She said people were exaggerating, but no one nodded. I looked at Clara, hoping for a smile, but she didn't even glance my way. She sat with her fork unmoving, her silence a wall I couldn't break through. I wanted to shout, to demand they all stop treating me like a criminal, but the words stuck in my throat. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at the petition again, the court stamp bold and final. I whispered to myself that I hadn't cheated, that I hadn't betrayed anyone, that it had only been a harmless joke. But the words sounded weak in the stillness of the room. Deacon's silence, his patience, his steady steps forward, all of it was heavier than my denials. For the first time, I felt the ground beneath me tilt, as if everything I had relied on was slipping away. The first time I sat across from Deacon in the legal office, I still believed I could talk my way out of everything. The room smelled of paper and coffee, the table polished to a shine that reflected the neat stacks of documents Jonas, his lawyer, had brought with him. My own lawyer sat beside me, whispering reassurances I barely listened to. I walked in prepared to roll my eyes, to paint Deacon as paranoid, to make the whole thing sound absurd. But the moment the meeting began, I realized the balance of power had shifted. Jonas opened the folder and began reading the petition aloud, his tone calm, detached, precise. The first evidence was the infamous hotel room joke, repeated through multiple witness statements. People from the reunion had signed sworn affidavits saying they heard me joke about staying with Damien, saw me lean close to him, and watched Deacon's humiliation. Each statement was stamped, notarized, bound together in an unshakable chain. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to laugh. I said people exaggerated stories when they were drinking. That gossip had blown everything out of proportion. I accused Deacon of clinging to petty slights to make himself look like a victim. But Jonas didn't falter. He slid another folder forward. Social media posts. I froze as I recognized my own words. Screenshots I had forgotten existed. Messages I had sent to a friend that night, repeating the joke with a smug little flourish, laughing about how Deacon would probably sulk about it later. I wanted to scream that it was still just humor, nothing more, but my voice cracked as I tried to explain. My lawyer cleared his throat, asking if the context had been misrepresented, but even he sounded uncertain. I felt exposed, my own words turned into weapons against me. Then came the financial documents. Deacon had already secured Clara's savings account, locked joint funds to prevent reckless withdrawals, and reassigned household bills into his name. Everything was neatly prepared, legal signatures stamped in blue ink. I slammed my hand on the table, calling it cruelty, accusing him of trying to strangle me financially. But Jonas countered calmly, saying these steps ensured stability for Clara, protected her routine, and prevented conflict over spending. I shouted that Deacon was making me out to be reckless, but the evidence in front of me was airtight. Even my lawyer leaned back, his lips pressed thin, as though he had no argument strong enough to counter it. Finally, Jonas read a list of Clara's recent school notes. Her teacher had written concerns about her quietness, her distraction in class, her sudden reluctance to participate. The implication was clear. Our conflict was seeping into her life. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I told the room Clara was just sensitive, that children adjusted quickly, that Deacon was manipulating her to look sad. My own words sounded cruel even to me, but I pushed them out anyway, desperate to shift the blame. Jonas didn't respond with anger. He simply let the silence sit heavy until it broke me more than shouting ever could. When Deacon finally spoke, his voice was steady, calm, and devastating. He said he wasn't seeking revenge, only protection for his daughter. He said he couldn't allow Clara to grow up in an environment filled with mockery, instability, and lies. He said he still wished I could see the damage I had done, but since I refused, he had no choice but to let the court decide. His words pierced deeper than any accusation. He didn't sound bitter. He sounded done. I tried one last desperate tactic, turning to him and insisting he was exaggerating, that he was trying to destroy me because he couldn't handle a confident wife. I said he was insecure, that no man secure in himself would drag his own wife into legal battles over a joke. But the words fell flat in the quiet room. My lawyer shifted uncomfortably, papers rustling as if he wanted to hide behind them. Jonas only nodded, making notes in the margin of his file. By the end of the meeting, I felt stripped bare. Deacon gathered his papers neatly, thanked his lawyer, and stood. He didn't look at me with anger. He looked at me with something worse, pity. He told the judge's ruling would speak louder than anything either of us could say. Then he left with Jonas, calm and steady, while I sat frozen in my chair, gripping the custody petition until my knuckles went white. That night, I tried calling him, leaving voicemails that shifted from fury to pleading to bitterness. He never replied. When I finally spoke to Eleanor, she told me not to panic, that courts rarely sided fully with fathers, that Deacon was bluffing. But even she sounded unsure now, her voice carrying cracks of doubt. Marjorie, on the other hand, sent me a message saying I had finally learned what it meant to disrespect her son. I deleted it instantly, but the words burned anyway. At my next visitation, Clara sat stiff on the couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I tried to make her laugh, offering snacks, telling stories, but she only nodded politely. At one point, she whispered that kids at school said Daddy looked sad and Mommy looked like she was in trouble. My chest squeezed painfully, but I forced a smile, telling her people always gossip, that Daddy just liked to make things dramatic. She didn't argue, but her silence was worse than any words. When Deacon came to pick her up, she rose quickly, her little backpack already on her shoulders, her eyes avoiding mine. Watching her walk out the door with him left me hollow, clutching at excuses that no longer convinced anyone, not even myself. Later, another envelope arrived, this one a formal notice for the court date. My hands shook as I read it. It was official now. There would be no more laughter, no more pretending it was harmless, no more spinning it into gossip. The law was stepping in, and Deacon was prepared in a way I could never match. I sat on the couch that night with the papers scattered across my lap, whispering that it was just a joke, just a harmless comment, nothing more. But the silence of the room swallowed the words whole, leaving me with nothing but the ticking clock and the knowledge that Deacon's calm, lawful strategy was about to close, around me like a cage I couldn't escape. The courtroom was colder than I imagined, not in temperature but in atmosphere. Everything about it felt sharp and deliberate, the judge's gaze, the polished wood, the neat stacks of documents resting in front of Deacon's lawyer. I sat with my own attorney, clutching my notes, reminding myself over and over that I hadn't done anything wrong. It had been a joke, just a joke, yet the air in that room made my defenses feel like thin paper already torn. Deacon sat across from me, his posture upright, his expression steady. He didn't look at me with anger, only calm determination, and that unnerved me more than if he had shouted. Proceedings began, with evidence being presented one piece at a time. The witness statements were read aloud. Former classmates who heard me tease about sharing a hotel room with Damien. People who noticed Deacon's discomfort while I laughed at his expense. Their words echoed in the room, stamped with official seals, their certainty solid. My lawyer objected here and there, trying to argue exaggeration, but the judge's expression gave little away. I sat frozen, forcing myself to smirk, as if the testimonies were ridiculous, though my chest was tight. Next came the social media screenshots. I recognized them instantly. My own posts from that night, laughing about Deacon sulking, repeating the joke as if it were clever. I swallowed hard, wanting to shout that they were just words, but Deacon's lawyer let the posts speak for themselves. My lawyer whispered for me to stay calm, to answer carefully when questioned, but my hands trembled as I adjusted the papers in front of me. The judge asked directly why I'd written those things. I said it was humor, that I liked to entertain people, that Deacon couldn't handle a confident woman. The words left my mouth, brittle and defensive, falling flat in the silence. Financial documents were introduced next, showing how Deacon had secured our daughter's accounts, locked down household expenses, and created stability while separation loomed. I leaned forward, accusing him of cruelty, of punishing me through money. But the judge shook his head slightly, asking me what protections I had put in place for Clara. My throat closed. I had no answer. Deacon's lawyer calmly stated that his client had acted responsibly, ensuring that bills were paid and routines preserved, while I had shown instability in both words and behavior. The truth was unbearable, but it was on paper, and it carried more weight than my protests ever could. Then came the school notes. Clara's teacher had written about her quietness, her distraction, her sudden anxiety. The implication was unmistakable. She was being pulled into a conflict she didn't deserve. I muttered that children were resilient, that Clara was fine, but even I could hear the coldness in my voice. My lawyer cleared his throat nervously, shifting his papers as though to avoid my eyes. Across the room, Deacon listened with steady composure, his face solemn but not triumphant. When Deacon finally spoke, his voice was calm and devastating. He said he wasn't seeking revenge, only stability for Clara. He explained that my words, my public mockery, and my refusal to acknowledge damage had left him with no other option but to seek custody. He didn't raise his voice, didn't hurl accusations. His restraint made him sound like the only adult in the room, and I felt suddenly small, my excuses crumbling around me. I whispered to myself that it wasn't fair, that he was twisting everything, but the courtroom air swallowed my words before they reached anyone else. The judge leaned back, silent for a long moment before speaking. His ruling came clear and final. Temporary custody of Clara was awarded to Deacon. Financial accounts would remain secured under his management. My visitation would be limited to supervised hours until further review. The words fell like stones, each one heavier than the last. My chest tightened, tears stung my eyes, but I forced myself not to cry, not to give Deacon the satisfaction. I told myself I was still her mother, that this couldn't be permanent, that jokes weren't enough to destroy a family. But the documents in front of me told a different story, stamped and signed, irreversible in their authority. Deacon didn't gloat. He didn't smile or smirk or say a single cruel word. When the gavel struck, he simply nodded respectfully at the judge and began to gather his papers. That calmness cut deeper than anger ever could. For the first time, I understood he didn't need to fight me anymore. He had already won, not with rage or vengeance, but with patience, evidence, and the weight of the law. As I left the courthouse, I caught sight of Clara standing beside Marjorie in the hallway. She looked small, her backpack hanging off one shoulder, her eyes tired. I called her name softly, hoping she would run into my arms. She looked at me for only a second before lowering her gaze and stepping closer to her grandmother. The rejection was quiet but absolute, and it hollowed me out more than the judge's ruling. I wanted to scream that I was still her mother, that I hadn't betrayed anyone, that it was all a misunderstanding. But the truth was written in every silence, every avoidance, every legal paper I carried with me as I walked out the door. Back in my apartment that night, I spread the visitation schedule on the table, the ink stark against the white paper. I whispered again and again that it had been only a joke, just words, nothing more. But the mantra sounded brittle, broken, as though even I no longer believed it. The law had spoken, Deacon had claimed his dignity, and I was left clutching papers that marked the boundary between what I thought I controlled and what I had truly lost. His lawful revenge was complete, and there was nothing left for me to twist or deny. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.